Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 3.37, and in this lesson we're going to be talking about the first of Bitwig's two dedicated distortion devices. And the first one is aptly named Distortion, and I guess we could say it is vaguely modeled on an analog circuit type of distortion. So to me it sounds most like a sort of like guitar amplifier that you would hear. And then we also have the Bit 8, which is a digital distortion device. So where distortion varies from the other effects we've looked at is in how it deals with the frequency content inherent in the signal. So with the filter, the ladder, the EQ2, the EQ5, and the EQ DJ, we've basically taken the content that already exists in the sound and either cut it out in the case of the filter with reductive EQ, or we've boosted it up, right? So we've actually added some gain to that location. What distortion does is distortion actually takes a look, well, not necessarily a look, but you get what I'm trying to say. It will analyze the actual signal itself and will grab onto some of the harmonics and the actual content inherent, the frequency content inherent in the signal. And not only will it boost and cut certain areas like an EQ, but it will actually introduce completely new harmonics and new overtones and new partials. So that's where these differ, and that's why the distortion is so important when it comes to working in the digital domain. And it was also really important in the analog domain. The second recording technology began, we had the concept of distortion. You think about the signal to noise ratio when you record something with a microphone. In the old days, that was a really big problem. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. We've explained how all things vibrate. And so in a way, all things are producing sound. It's just that we only have a very limited range of frequencies in which we can hear 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. But everything is vibrating around you. The table that's in front of me, it's vibrating. It's just not vibrating at an audible rate, at least not for me as a human being. Now, once you start to plug things in and once you start to run current through them, which, when you plug something into the wall and you have a cable or a cord of some kind, you are starting to introduce more and more vibrations. That's what's going to happen when you run electricity through something. It begins to vibrate, and therefore it gives us power. And in a lot of cases, if your cable is too long or if it's just an old cable, you can actually start to get some of that hum, some of that electric hum, and that's usually down in the 40, 30, up to sometimes 50 to 60 hertz range. And that became a big problem for old recording studios. And so they did a lot of work to try to minimize that distortion, that feedback. Really what that is distortion into the signal because it's not inherent in the original signal itself. The same thing with tape machines. And this is why in the analog domain, you want to record as loud as possible without distorting too much. The key word there is too much, because in the analog domain, it's okay to distort because we're not working inside of a computer. We're working with things that vibrate naturally. And what was realized early on, especially with some of those older mixing boards like the Neve and the SSL, which you can search on Google, and there's all sorts of cult followings with these analog mixing boards, these things are vibrating naturally. And so when you start to go over that 0 point, you're not just hitting a wall. You're not just cutting off the top of the waveform like what we see in the digital domain. And if you are lost at anything I'm saying at this point, you need to go back and review some of the earlier videos because this is really all review. In the analog domain, it would cut off, but it would cut off at a really musical sort of way. And if you imagine the soft knee on a compressor, that's kind of what it's like when analog signal is going over 0. And actually, if we look at the filter here, this is a good example too. If we do it inside of the EQ2, imagine for a second that this is our analog mixing board. All right, when we're at 12 here, you can see this slope. Okay, it's a nice gradual slope here. And this is kind of what it's like when signal goes over 0 in the analog domain. In the digital domain, it's like this, only even steeper. Only imagine just a brick wall here. So in the analog domain, it's allowed to go over, and it's not just going to sound like static and like noise. It's actually going to sound very pleasing. or at least that was what was discovered, and that's what we've now been accustomed to and what we've grown up with in some of our favorite records. They've all taken advantage of that subtle saturation. Not only can you turn the volume up louder, which we like, but a lot of times it would actually distort at odd ordered harmonics. And odd ordered harmonics, if you remember back to our harmonics video, are the more consonant sounding harmonies, if you will. So think back to that vibrating string into the ratios. We had a 1-to-1, and then the 2-to-1 was the octave, and then the 3-to-2 was the perfect fifth, the 4-to-3 was the major third, etc., etc., etc. The lower those ratios, the more consonant the interval. And because that is what naturally happens, right? When something is vibrating, we showed that with the string, that's going to happen inside of a mixing console too. So what you'd get is very pleasing consonants to the saturation that was occurring. But the big point I'm trying to make, I guess, on the whole, is just that distortion and saturation have been around from the very beginning of not only electricity, but also recorded medium. And it's always been this constant struggle for a long time to get rid of all of those unwanted frequencies, to get rid of that distortion, or try to minimize it as much as possible. Until just recently, where distortion has kind of taken on a more of a retro quality. And I'm sure you've heard a record fairly recently. I'm trying to think of a pop record that's done this, that's either sampled that like vinyl scratch sound, or has got just a little bit of that grainy quality to it. Almost any track you listen to today is going to have it. And if you just listen really closely, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So today it's almost something that you want, but in the digital domain, it's something that we want to have as much control over as possible. And it's something that we will have as much control over as possible, since we have things like filters and we have EQs and we have our tool devices. So we can just drop the distortion in and along the chain, and then we're able to control it, so it doesn't just get totally out of hand, and we can keep our signal flow and everything in bounds, if you will. The other important thing I want to mention about distortion before moving on is that distortion and saturation can really be used to widen and beef up your sounds without actually adding any gain and without going into crazy compression or limiting. And for me, saturation distortion is probably my favorite tool, and it's something I get super excited about every time I drop it on a particular sound, because I just love the way that the distortion grabs some of those harmonics and how it messes with the fundamental, and how you can see on our Spectrum device the way that it's adding and subtracting at certain places. For me, it's just the most fascinating and interesting thing. Then again, I am a total dork, so it's not surprising that I find that so interesting. The thing about the Bitwig distortion device is that it sounds very, very digital, and it's not particularly pleasing. And we'll talk about why that is when we bring it in. But for now, let's just go back to our sine tone. So here's our sine tone, and we can see that there are some extra harmonics here. And for the purpose of this demonstration, I really don't want those. So I'm actually going to add in a filter here right at the start and try to just get us back to our fundamental. Let's see, where's our cutoff at? We're at 441. This is at 440. That works for me. There's just a little bit down there, but it's not even going to be audible. However, we're going to notice pretty quickly that even though we've tried to get rid of these, the distortion device itself, in a lot of cases, is just amplifying the signal. And so those peaks that you saw are going to come back up in just a couple of seconds. So let's add in the distortion device. And it's really a pretty confusing distortion, to be 100% honest. We have here 3 sections, and then the master, mix, and width section. First thing, let's turn the mix down to 50%, so we can get 50% of our original signal and then 50% of the distorted signal. I also want to turn the width to 100%, which I think is default if you double click. And here in this post effects section, I'm going to turn the level to 0, basically unity. And then I'm going to mess with the high cut and the low cut filters just to pull them back so that we're getting our full signal without any post processing. Distortion can get out of hand very quickly. In fact, I recorded this video before, and I spent like 40 minutes making a video only for the screen capture software to go absolutely bananas when I really went crazy with the overdrive. So in this video, I'm going to have to be careful, and I do apologize for any technical difficulties that may occur down the road. It's also like 100 degrees today, so I'm not sure if I'm like just frying my computer. We have a pre-EQ as well, which we could have tried to use to get rid of that extra harmonics there, and maybe we'll try it in a second. But for now, we can just turn the gain to 0, pull the Q all the way down, and it's not going to have any effect at all on our signal. And then we get into the actual distortion parameters, and we just have 4 parameters. And these are kind of different and they're kind of new. And the reason I say this reminds me so much of like an old school guitar amplifier is because we have a slew control, we have a symmetry control, and then we have this DC bias control down here. I'm going to try to explain these in layman's terms, but even I don't fully understand what's happening here. So if you want, feel free to search all of these terms online in Google, and you might be able to understand them just a little bit better. But for now, let's just turn everything down. The symmetry control I'm going to put right to 0 here because it actually has a positive and negative control. However, with all of my tests so far, it seems like when you push this positive or negative, it has almost exactly identical effect, which wasn't something I was expecting, to be 100% honest. So if we play back our sine tone, with most traditional saturators and distortions, sometimes there's just one parameter, and that parameter is oftentimes the drive control. So if I play this back and I up the drive, nothing is happening. So obviously the drive control inside of this distortion device is dependent upon something else. Let's see, is it dependent upon symmetry? Doesn't seem to be. Is it dependent upon DC bias? Doesn't seem to be. So that leaves us with one extra choice, and that's the slew. And typically the slew is when an amplifier or transductor is required to change its output. Basically meaning if we turn the slew up to 100%, it's like just turning on our amplifier. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put it to 100%, and right away we're going to hear what's happened. I'm actually going to turn it down so we don't blow our eardrums out. This level control is going to be super handy. So you can see there are certain points here on the slew where it emphasizes those harmonics, and in other places it doesn't. And that's very interesting, and that's very reminiscent of like an old school amp. Like if you turn it a certain amount, when you're making those changes, it's displacement. And so it can sometimes displace the fundamental, which in this case is the 440, and bring in some extra overtones and harmonics. Oops. But for now, I'm just going to crank this up to 100, which should basically just be like turning our amplifier on. Now we're working with more of a traditional distortion device in that I can turn this drive up subtly, and we're going to start to add in some overtones and some harmonics. Now, the interesting thing is, what I would expect to happen, and what would happen in most analog systems, is that the first overtone that should be popping up is actually our octave. So right now we're at A440. What I would expect to come up would be an 880, but that's not actually the case. We're getting back to like what we saw before. What's popping up is actually an octave and a fifth. And even if I pull this drive up 100%, and this is where I got into trouble before. You're probably hearing my computer fan again. It's actually literally 100 degrees today here. So if I pull this up, we're never seeing that 880 harmonic. And the reason has to do with the symmetry. And the symmetry control is actually going to determine the types of harmonics that are going to be present in this distortion device. You would think, and one would think, that if you turn it to the left, you would get more of odd order harmonics, very consonant. And if you turned it to the right, it would emphasize both even and odd ordered harmonics. That doesn't seem to be the way it works. It seems to work where either way you turn it, you get the same harmonics. But even a 1% difference, and you're going to see those frequencies popping up, those harmonics and overtones. So now we do have an 880, and if I turn the symmetry knob even more, we're going to start to emphasize some additional harmonics here in the signal, and it's going to start to sound a little bit more consonant. Go too far, and then you're pushing both the odd and even harmonics quite a bit, and so it's going to start to sound pretty dissonant like it does there. But if you can find those sweet spots, it sounds pretty nice, at least to me. I'm going to pull the drive back a little bit so it's not quite so crazy. That sounds pretty good. Right now we're at minus 48%. Let's see what happens if I type in 48%, and we're just gonna watch this frequency spectrum here. Absolutely no change. So I'm not sure what's going on there. Maybe it's dependent on the slew control as well, and perhaps the DC bias. Not 100% sure. The DC bias is kind of strange and different, and I'd encourage you guys to look this up. But basically, the DC bias or the DC offset is the mean value of the waveform. And in most cases, like even our sine wave here, what we have is a pretty perfect wave. So we have our center line here, we have our compression stage, and then we have our rarefaction stage, and it's cyclical like any waveform. Where the DC bias comes into play is, and this again happens a lot of times on old amplifiers, and if your DC bias gets off, what actually happens is the wave would literally push up. So you would have a smaller rarefaction stage, and you'd be pushing harder on that compression stage. And so the speakers wouldn't be working as efficiently, and it can also add some changes to tonality as well. So we can play with this DC bias and see what we get. Sometimes it will have more of an effect than at other times. Like right there, you're getting more of a Comey filter sort of effect. And if we crank it all the way up, we're now actually really looking a little bit more like an odd ordered harmonics chain you would expect. So instead of that E being really the forceful part, we're getting the two A's, and so it should sound a lot more consonant here. Until we mess with the drive parameter. See if we can dial in something nice. This should also be an A up here too. So for now, I'm just going to leave that DC bias up to 100. Again, we could use our pre-filter here if we wanted to cut something out prior to the distortion. So if we were to put this on, I'm going to turn the mix down. If we were to put this on the chord, for example, I gotta turn off the filter. Maybe we want to cut out some of this low stuff going on here. Or really this has to be done before distortion, so I'm going to turn the drive off. So let's see, what do I want to cut out? Let's cut out some of this low information. Turn the mix up so that we can actually hear a difference. Okay, cool. And now we can start to add some of that drive in here. And then add in some of those even and odd ordered harmonics. Try to match our levels. Gain staging is always super important when you're working with any kind of distortion device, because not only are you going to be adding more content in the frequency spectrum, but that will also increase the gain. So just be sure to keep a constant eye on that level control there, so you can try to keep things pretty even, so you're not being tricked into thinking that something is sounding better just because it's louder. Last but not least, we have this post EQ, which we can work with. So maybe we want to get rid of some of these extra highs up here. You can take those out. Get more of a warm sound. And then if we wanted, we could add another EQ here. And then perhaps we like the way this low end is sounding. Could really boost that up. Emphasize the fundamental. again. One more tool to turn it down just a little bit. Increase the width. Doesn't sound too good. And there you go. That's pretty much how the distortion device works. The truth is, I've been struggling a lot to get this distortion device to sound nice, to sound like I want it to sound. And again, it all depends on what you're actually working it on, what you're going to put it on. I don't have too many good examples here. I do have something going on here. I just have a default patch in. And so if I play this here, let's add a distortion to this and see if we can come up with something good. Again, I'm going to pull the mix down quite a bit. Pull these guys back. Not going to deal with this for right now. Let's see if we can get something sounding nice here. So that sounds pretty nice. That sounds pretty much like a digital synthesizer. And then a little bit of this distortion, you start to get a little more of that old school house kind of vibe. Maybe a little DC bias just for fun. And then again, I'd probably emphasize that low end even a little bit more. And then since I'm adding all this gain, I'll put another tool in here and pull this down. Even add a little more of that in. And then without the distortion, without the EQ, and then with the EQ and the distortion, let's turn it up so you actually get a better feel. Takes me a long time to even get there. Okay, pretty simple, pretty cool stuff. But the truth is you're going to struggle quite a bit with this distortion. I've struggled with it a lot. This is kind of the best I've been able to come up with using it. You got to be pretty subtle with a lot of these controls. If you really overdo it, it is hard to get it to sound very good. Let's see, I might overdo it here. Let's just... Actually, that sounds pretty good. But that's probably still too much for my taste. That's probably what I'd use in an actual context of working with it. But I did want to show you guys and provide you with some places to find some other distortion devices. Remember, there's all different types of distortion: tape, tool, transistor, solid state. You also have like your amplifiers, like guitar amps, and then you have distortion pedals and stomp boxes. And the plugin world is now full of these sorts of devices. One of the reasons for that, they've just become super, super popular. Again, the past 2 or 3 years, it's like every company is putting these things out there. And even recently, Waves have released a couple of like tape machine emulators, one from the Abbey Road studio, and then there's a Kramer tape machine as well. And so just so much out there today. And just like when you have a lot of for-pay things, there's a lot of free ones out there too. And so here's a good website for you to find a bunch of free distortion devices, saturation devices. A lot of these are based off of analog machines or old school analog hardware. So I'll link to this in the description. This is the one time I would encourage you to pick up some of these. I use Nebula quite a bit. It is an insane piece of software, but it does take up like a ton of CPU. I'm also familiar with this saturation knob. That's quite nice. Again, a very simple one turn of the dial, and the towel tube is great as well. So I'd encourage you guys to check all of those out. I'm sure many of these sound great. This guy does a great job on his website, so he's probably only picked out some of the best stuff for you. Last but not least, since when I made this video before and I was working with the distortion, I really struggled to get it to sound very good. I thought I'd show you another distortion device, one that is for pay. I think it's $100 now, but it's really, really good. When it was first released, it was probably like $200, maybe $300. And this one is from URS Unique Recording Systems, I think is what that stands for. And with this device, you have pretty much one knob. You have your input, and you can really push the input to try to drive it even more into the saturation stage. And then all you have is this knob controlling how much drive or saturation is going on. And then you have the output to try to compensate, as well as the dry wet control. And then in here, you can choose a bunch of different types of saturation, and they all sound great. A lot of these are modeled off of very, very vintage and rare pieces of hardware. So for $100, it's really totally worth it, especially if you work like in a real studio type situation. You're probably going to want to have a tool like this. And let's just put it on this synthesizer here and see what it sounds like quickly. I am geeking out just a little bit. I do apologize for that, but sometimes you got to do it, right? So let's take a listen and maybe try out a couple of these different models and see what we come up with. Did I put in the wrong thing? Well, for whatever reason, it's not working on there, so we can put it back over on the cord device. I always run into problems when I'm taping these videos. I don't know what's up with that, but whatever. Let's see, is it actually running through here now, or just having problems? There we go. Okay, cool. So we can just run through a few of these different models. Turn the output up to match. And really drive the input here. Here's width. You hear that one's pretty grimy. Pull back a little bit. That one sounds real nice, doesn't it? A FET circuit. This is from the 1950s, so it's like an API probably. Really grimy, like you get that Amy Winehouse kind of feel to it. You could definitely put that all over pianos and like a Wurlitzer or something, and it would just be pure gold on that. There's also a tape deck here from a tube. So this is going to sound really warm. This is really going to be hyping those odd harmonics. We could look at it in the span too, maybe. We could see it. So this one's going to sound super musical. And there's the tape. And then a couple of transformers. So that's one of the better like sampled, convolution sampled, modeled saturation devices out there. But again, there are hundreds and hundreds of these things. They flooded the market the past couple of years, and there's a lot of good free ones too. So don't feel like you have to pay for something, because there are phenomenal examples of free ones out there, and really they should serve you well. You can put these after reverbs, you can put these after delays. So if you want to saturate the reverb or the delay a little bit, you can do that. Really, when you put your mind to it, so much that can be done with these very simple devices. And as I mentioned before, it's a great alternative to just slapping on a compressor or slapping on a limiter. People often wonder, why do my sounds sound so plastic? most of the time it's because you're not running it through even subtle amounts of distortion or saturation. It really does make a big difference. And I hope this video has been helpful for you guys. At some point in the future, if people are interested in it, I would love to do a whole series on distortion and saturation. I could talk hours and hours about it, and then there are other people who are a lot more knowledgeable than me that I'm sure could do entire courses on the different types of saturation and all the different types of actual hardware analog circuitry that's going on and why things sound as they do. It's absolutely fascinating stuff if you're a total dork like me. Maybe a couple of you guys out there are dorks as well, so we can all unite together and talk about different types of saturation and distortion. But thank you guys so much for listening and for watching this video. I hope it all went out well. I've been trying this afternoon. It's been quite a struggle. So thank you for sitting through it, and you'll hear from me again in the next lesson. Take care.